And PSR Wisconsin's mission is to eradicate nuclear weapons, fight for climate action, and eliminate environmental toxins. So that's what we're all about. And today, I'd like to welcome Allen here. And Allen, would you like to introduce yourself for us?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So I'm Allen Hester. I'm the grassroots coordinator for the Nuclear Weapons Abolition Program at PSR National in Washington, D.C., although I'm currently in Northern Virginia in my apartment. And I focus on offering congressional outreach opportunities to all the chapters in our network. And I try my best to stay up to speed on what's happening in Congress, although it's getting increasingly harder to do that. And I've been making efforts, I think if you summed up all the work that I do, it's trying to make efforts to make sure that our local work and our state work and our national work all connect, that they're all going towards a similar goal, that they help one another to achieve each other's goals, and just more coordination, I think, in PSR and with our allies at every level.
Great, thank you, Allen, for all your work you're doing. So I'm going to start asking some questions about the START treaty. So my first one is, in basic terms, can you explain what the START treaty is and, if there's a difference between that and the New START treaty extension?
Right. So the START treaty and the New START treaty are related in the sense that they both covered similar things, but the New START treaty was, I guess, the newer variation of that line of treaties. And what it really did was it actually decreased, especially the nuclear weapons department, although it covers multiple weapons, it decreased the amount of weapons that both the United States and Russia had deployed by about 30%, the New START treaty. And that was when it was put into effect in February 2011. And the treaty basically restricts the amount of deployed strategic warheads that each country can have to about 1,500 strategic warheads, as well as limiting other kinds of missiles and heavy bombers are the other kinds of weapon systems it limits. But the other important part of the treaty is that it provides verification protocols. So this allows both Russia and the United States to go into on-site inspections in one another's arsenals, make sure that each side is following through with the agreements of this treaty, following through with the limits, and then both of them can take that data back and analyze it with their own experts and I guess verify constantly. And I believe it's 18 times a year they can do that on short notice as well. So it provides a lot of transparency between the two biggest nuclear powers in the world. Despite that, and despite transparency being, I think, a huge part of almost all of our treaties when it comes to nuclear weapons, the Trump administration has been more prone to leaving those treaties, I guess in the sense that he doesn't believe that they're valuable as much as they could be. He always sees a flaw or some area that it doesn't cover, and he uses that as a justification to leave multiple treaties. So we saw him leave, the treaty we had with Iran, the JCPOA. We've seen him leave the INF Treaty, another nuclear policy treaty, and we've seen him just recently leave the Open Skies Treaty, which was another really important verification method that we had to check for both Russia and the United States to check what we were doing. So this really is seen now as kind of the last treaty we have from the Cold War, I guess the Cold War era of our arms control, right? Since we reacted to the buildup of the Cold War and developed responses and policies and treaties, this is really the last one we have from that era. And it's important to note that because the administration currently is basically saying that old era didn't do anything for us. And they're trying to argue that all of these agreements, while valued by arms control experts, could have been more effective if structured differently. And, I think the important thing to think about is, Donald Trump has proven that he's a transactional guy. And if he sees that, he thinks he could be winning more, the US could be taking more, he'll automatically say we should be doing that. The problem with New START is that we just need an extension, right? So we're coming up on a point where basically Putin and Trump could agree right now, you know what, this is a good setting stone. We want to have these limits. These limits are safe for now, but we got to do more. I mean, Trump could easily say that. He could say, we have to do more. We have to loop in China, which is one of his biggest things he wants to do with arms control. But he sees existing arms control agreements as obstacles, when really the majority of arms control experts would say that those are stepping stones. that there's something to have to keep stability while we continue the conversation into how we could do better. But he sees it as something he needs to rip down before he can build back up.
Okay. That's really, really important. Thank you for explaining that all and sharing it. You kind of hit on some of these points, but is there anything else you can emphasize on why this extension is just so incredibly important at this time?
Right. So, I think that the number one thing is obviously there's a lot going on. With COVID, with all of the racial injustice fights, civil unrest, there's clearly a multitude of things to be thinking about. Obviously, Congress is concerned with a lot of different issues ever since we've been dealing with COVID response. Their priorities have really been focused there. That being said, this is just one of those issues where if we allow it to be forgotten about, if we allow this treaty to fall to the wayside because we're dealing with so many other issues, it's only going to cause more instability, right? And we're dealing with an unstable environment. And so I think stability is the goal right now. And obviously there's, different opinions on how we achieve stability, but certainly in the midst of a domestic COVID response that needs our attention and resources, and also clearly the focus that we need to have, domestically on the conversation happening right now. The important thing is that if we don't think about this issue now, and if we don't, if Congress especially doesn't make it a priority, that by the time this treaty does expire in February of next year, which isn't that long away, when it comes to treaties and figuring out what we're going to do with our adversaries, if we let that go away, we're talking about entering a new arms race in the midst of all of the instability that we see right now. So really what this treaty is going to do for us in this current environment is it's going to allow, at least in one part of our foreign policy with a very important actor, to say, look, we have a lot more work to do. We're going to keep at this level of stability so that we can focus for the meantime on things like COVID response and the things that are really pressing. But if we allow this to fall to the wayside, essentially Congress and the president are going to be dealing with a brand new world after February, where there aren't going to be limitations on the kinds of arsenals the United States or Russia could be building. There aren't going to be verifications on us checking on each other on what we're building and what we're making. And that's in the midst of them looking at throwing billions of more dollars at modernization programs. So there's money going into these programs, and we're looking at basically a world where tons of money is going to be going to new weapons that are no longer limited by treaties.
All right, great. Thank you for sharing. I think you really hit a good point there, and I'm so glad that you made that point. So you kind of alluded to this, but there seems to be a deadline. So what exactly is the deadline, and what is the current status of the extension at the congressional level?
Right. So this is kind of the interesting part with treaties where, we are now looking at a presidential level and a congressional level. So at the presidential level, extension is really simple. We see a deadline coming up on February. Putin has voiced that he sees New START as important, not only for US and Russian relations, but for global stability, considering that it involves Russia and the US. And on the first conversation he had with Trump when Trump won, he brought up New START. And he said, this is something we have to have a conversation about. So at this point, we're really just waiting for Trump to sign on to the agreement that Putin has already said he's ready to sign, a 5-year extension. So at the presidential level, what's happening there is that Trump is essentially saying, that's great, we're looking into signing that, but we want China involved. And they believe, at least the administration believes, that by providing a maximum pressure campaign on both Russia and China in the sense of saying, we're going to not sign this immediately, we'll wait, they think that will pressure Russia to pressure China to get involved in the conversation. And what China has said in response to that is, when it comes to the nuclear issue, Russia and the US are unique. That yes, we have nuclear weapons, yes, we're a nuclear power, but in the sense of the pure numbers of weapons, it's still so distinctly the Russia and the United States. And until they limit their own numbers, we don't have to come to the table. And anybody can go look at charts of how many weapons each country has, and it makes sense. So that's kind of the Trump logic. So the congressional response is that there is a bill, both in the House and the Senate. And this is in the House, it's HR 2529, and in the Senate, it's S2394. And that's the Richard G. Lugar and Ellen O. Tosher Act to maintain limits on Russian nuclear forces. The bill has bipartisan support in both chambers of Congress. And essentially what the bill is saying is, okay, if you're going to leave this New START treaty, you have to inform Congress ahead of time. You can't just wait until the February deadline. You have to provide evidence that Russia is breaking the rules of the treaty, right? So have substantial evidence to say the treaty isn't working anyways. Or he has to provide a better treaty that at least covers what the New START treaty covered in terms of limiting weapons. And essentially what this would do is it would allow Congress to say, we're going to check the president's authority to unilaterally leave treaties, because when all these treaties were ratified, they needed congressional approval. They needed Congress to be involved to make them happen. So the fact that the president can just leave them on a whim, it is a way for Congress to kind of grit teeth down on the president's authority. And we've seen them do that more recently, especially in terms of Iran, saying that they're going to check what he's doing in Iran and say that they're against some of the actions he's taken there. This is another example of that. This would be them saying, you don't just have unilateral power, we're checking the power of the president, and it would really be then up to the president to decide if he's going to veto it and say, no, I don't care that Congress has a problem with this. I'm just going to unilaterally do it. And then he would carry the responsibility of carrying us into this new era without arms control, or Congress could step up. But the good news is it has bipartisan support. Both these bills have Republicans on it. And in the meetings that we've had in other PSR chapters, it's really an issue that Republicans seem to be willing to talk with us about. And it makes sense when you see how Congress responded to him leaving other nuclear treaties. We saw even Republican leadership in some of the committees that dealt with treaties, foreign affairs, for example, coming out and saying, look, this isn't okay for the president to do this. This took a lot of work. This makes our allies and our adversaries more cautious about working with us. And it just doesn't make us look like someone that you can trust to make these kinds of agreements. So when we go into these Republican offices to talk about issues like no first use, which a lot of us thought wasn't going to be a big deal, to a lot of Republicans was a big deal. It was something, it was seen as a lot more radical of a thing to say than we thought. Compared to New START, it just doesn't seem to have that image. It seems like it's something that we can get into new offices with, we can make new allies and relationships with. And I think really come out the other side of New START saying, oh, like, great, you're a Republican, but you're clearly a champion of arms control. Let's have that discussion more. So it's really an entry way to talk about all of our issues, including abolition, with offices that maybe haven't heard that side of the argument before.
Great. Yeah, I think that's really thrilling to think about something like this being bipartisan.
Right.
And, in our time, it's just really exciting to think about something not being that you could go across the aisle with. So that's really hopeful to hear and really exciting to hear, and almost a little sense of relief that we can talk about this issue. And on that note, for someone at home during COVID, during all of this, do you have any advice for how someone can help push this extension forward, or get involved, or feel like they're doing something for the greater good?
Right. Well, in Wisconsin's specific, I'll use Wisconsin as an example. First, as we said, Wisconsin has Republican representatives, and I know for a lot of advocates that work on, especially something like nuclear weapons abolition, right? A lot of times the feeling is, for some Democrats, I'm trying to, have a conversation about this issue, and it's hard, let alone Republicans who seem to be harder on security. But this is different, and I think it's different for two reasons. One, people see the validity of not wanting to go back into what the Cold War was. Whether it's that's something when it comes to arms control, bipartisanship in that arena. People got to remember that some of the biggest leaps taken in arms control during the Cold War was by Reagan, was by a Republican. And that has a history there with our movement, and I think with treaties. Right, the idea that even that is an area bipartisanship can happen, that is an area that bipartisanship values can happen. But for someone at home, and especially in Wisconsin, I think there's two strategies. In the short term, get Republicans to know that this is an issue. Get Republicans to know that there's a bill that they can support. And I think more importantly, and this is true, Republican co-sponsorships would actually do more for the bill, I think, right now than ever, compared to Democratic co-sponsorships. And actually, one of the strategies of getting this bill to be supported is that we actually want to have an even number of Democrats and Republicans supporting it the whole way. So every time a Republican can co-sponsor that bill, there's usually another Democrat that wants to co-sponsor, but they don't want to overwhelm the bill with Democrats because they want to see it as a bipartisan fight. So in the short term, talk to your Republican offices in your state, talk to your senators, the Republican, and say this is an issue you care about and you want to see your name on this issue. and that it's important to our security, that this verification protocol, it provides intelligence, it provides security for our troops, it provides security for us at home. So if you talk about it from the basis of security to Republican offices, they're going to hear you. I would say that the other side of that coin of why this is different in the coming months of this fight, even though the next 4 weeks for our Republican friends would be really nice if we had their support. But for the rest of the year, we have the Hiroshima Nagasaki anniversary approaching. And last year on the 74th anniversary, we had more offices co-sponsor our issues because they saw it as an important time to be plugged in to our issues.
Mhm.
And so especially with the 75th anniversary coming up and with a lot of momentum behind the 75th, this is a great time to reach out to offices and say, you know, my issue isn't, you know, you can't sideline my issue because there's a lot going on. This is a really key time. It's a key time to remember what these weapons can do. It's a key time to remember the world that existed before we had these treaties. And we have to think about what it would be like to enter that world again amid all COVID and everything else going on. It would just be more instability, and we don't need that right now. And I think that resonates across the aisle. In the long term, Wisconsin has progressive leaders. Wisconsin has congressional leaders in multiple areas of Congress, and they need to see this as a priority issue. And they're actually gearing up to. The Progressive Caucus is ready to make this a bigger issue this year. They were tired of military spending last year. They saw the huge price tag we were giving the Pentagon. And I think finally they're coming around and saying, look, nuclear weapons sounds ridiculous in an era where we have to get people PPE, we have to get people masks, and that there are communities that need help right now. So I guess looping this all back together, you can come back to your representatives and say, we need a new form of security, right? That security is important, and we're coming to you on the basis of security, but clearly just giving money to the Pentagon, just making nuclear weapons didn't keep us safe. You know, and we have to broaden that discussion. And I think especially for PSR and especially for an organization with a health voice, right, amid this COVID and amid, you know, seeing an overwhelmed health system. We've seen a lot of our doctors going in to talk about things like New Start and then being asked, hey, what do doctors need for, you know, this COVID response? You know, what do you see as the priority? So I think just because we're health professionals amid this environment, our voice does get lifted up. And whether that's talking about nuclear policy or the intersections of what's happening right now, I think that the health voice is resonating stronger and farther than ever. So especially if you're a PSR member linked to PSR anyway, you should feel empowered to talk about these issues because Congress seems more ready to hear you.
Thank you, Allen. Wow, I'm really thrilled that you shared that with how we can all get involved and the messaging, the type of messaging we can use to connect with our representatives. And I do want to tagline for those at home that PSR Wisconsin will be hosting some anniversary events for the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. To keep your eye out for those events and other things like this interview where we're talking about things going on. And I really want to thank you, Allen, for your time today, and thank you, PSR National, for allowing us to have you for the time being. And I just want to thank everyone for joining, and you can watch this video again. It'll be available on our website as well as on Facebook. Thank you,
Awesome.
Allen.
Thank you.